Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and I wish you a good day. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Social and Political Research of Republika Srpska, which has organized this conference. As you may know, this is the second forum organized in a similar format over the past month here at the Academy of Science. A month ago, we had a round table to discuss EU integration in light of the Ukrainian crisis. The venue was here as well. I'd like to thank the management of the Academy of Science and Arts of Republika Srpska, and I do hope we'll be able to continue our cooperation in the future on other projects. I'd like to welcome all of you who are here, who have come here despite this being Sunday morning. We have Professor Latinovic, who's a representative of the board. Also, we have representatives of President Zvjanovic. We have teaching assistants and students of Banja Luka University and University of Istočno Sarajevo. In particular, the School of Political Science, Sarajevo East University, who've traveled from Sarajevo East here to take part in this discussion, and they can serve as a good example to everyone else. I'd like to thank the student organization of Banja Luka University. This speaks for itself. That is about the intentions and aspirations of the center, and that is to make it possible for future members of the academia to partake in the fora at this level and to gradually involve them in different discussions and analyses of issues pertaining to Republika Srpska, so that they more easily navigate through these issues in the future. Thank you again for being here on this Sunday morning. I don't think that you made a mistake deciding to attend this session, because I think we'll be discussing quite interesting issues pertaining to Republika Srpska society as a whole and the crisis. The topic of today's session is the threat to democracy in the West, liberals, Democrats, conservatives, and the New World Order. So we'll be discussing one of the hottest topics that has attracted the attention of the public. We'll glance at the global developments and regional developments. We'll have the following speakers: Mr. Bob McEwen from the USA, the director of the Council for National Policy, the former congressman, served for 6 terms, one of the most renowned Republicans in the USA. At the same time, the Council for National Policy, whose executive director, Mr. Bob McEwen, is among the most renowned institutions in the US. We spent the day yesterday in Voljanic, marking the anniversary of one of the biggest airlift operations in the Second World War. This is one of the shining example of heroism of the Serbian people in the Second World War, and my ancestors were among them. So, Bob, thank you very much for being with us yesterday to build a culture of remembrance through these events. And thank you very much for being here and sharing your views on the situation. We have Ms. Ljiljana Smajlovic, and there is no need to introduce her, I believe, because Ms. Smajlovic has been a reporter working for a number of renowned journals and magazines since 2015. She's been a member of the Journalists Association, and also the president of the Court of Honor of the Journalists Association. She's been covering different topics. Thank you very much for your time and for being here. And also we have Mr. Obrad Kesic. And there is no need, I guess, to introduce him to our public. He's the head of the Representative Office of Republic of Srpska to the USA. He's a political analyst, expert in international relations and the US, and many more issues. Mr. Kesic, thank you very much and your support to the preparation of this event. I'd like to invite all of you to participate in the discussion after the keynote speeches, and I'd like to invite you to give your contribution to understanding the developments and phenomena in the society. So this forum is being recorded, and everything will be posted on our website so that others may hear what we will have discussed today. I'd also like to kindly ask all of you to introduce yourself when asking questions or commenting, so that everyone knows who you are. And please use a microphone so that the technician can record everything. We have simultaneous interpretation. You have headsets. Of course, you can ask questions in the Serbian language. So much for the introduction. I wish you successful work. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Obrad Kesic, who moderate this session.
Thank you. Anybody who needs the headphones, please reach for them now. It's a pleasure to be here again at the Academy of Sciences and to work with the Center again. Which I think is started with a wonderful start of its work, and I think this event's going to help define kind of the parameters of the type of academic and professional discussions that are expected in order to help institutions, academics, professional advisors, and others, and students in particular, who are the new generation being prepared to assume leadership positions in the future, understand kind of our world, the context of how decisions are made, and what affects and influences those decisions, and kind of the course of events in international relations. But more particularly, today's topic, it's a focus on democracy, and in particular, Western democracy. When Dusan and I discussed what we could do while we had the ability to have two very prominent guests with us today, two people who I have enormous respect for, who I think are some of the leading thinkers that I know, and who I have the pleasure of constantly engaging in dialogue and discussion, and their thoughts help me shape and form my own thoughts in many ways. In many ways, Bob McEwen is somebody who I've come to grow to understand and to learn from constantly as we travel, especially throughout the Balkans. Bob is one of the leading voices, conservative voices in the United States. He is somebody who is very modest. And in keeping in line with that modesty, I have to also say I'm humbled to be with both of them. Ljiljana comes from a little bit different perspective. She comes from a perspective on the left, and kind of what used to be considered the traditional left. But now I think she'll have a very difficult time, and she can talk about that, how she can find her place on the left, given everything that's happening on the left. Now the topic, why the topic? Why discuss the threats to democracy? Well, first, if we look at the war in Ukraine, most of the Western leaders are defining that war as a battle between democracy and autocracy. And they're saying that if one side, Russia, wins the war, this is almost going to be a fatal blow to democracy, especially Western democracy. So the significance that's being presented to the Western publics, especially in the United States, because it's hard for Americans in particular to understand why they should be sacrificing their pocketbooks, their family budget, to continue to support Ukraine when Ukraine is not an ally in NATO, does not have a defense alliance with the United States. There's not a treaty that obligates the United States to come to the defense of Ukraine or even to support Ukraine in the event of war. So many people ask themselves, why are we doing this? And the way that the political elite, but also the media establishment describes this oftentimes is that democracy is at stake. And if democracy is at stake, that means freedom is at stake. They try to put the context of this conflict in the context of the Second World War and kind of the alliance that was made to defeat Nazi Germany. The problem with that analogy and using that is that it ignores one very simple factor of history. The key to defeating Nazi Germany, in addition to the economic might of the United States and the major grind-up of production that not only assisted England in surviving against the onslaught of Nazi Germany, but it also helped Russia, the Soviet Union, build up the resources and the ability to go on the offensive and take on the mighty German military. The key is that the Soviet Union was an ally. So the world, even in that context, wasn't black and white. The Soviets played an integral part of the defeat of Nazi Germany. You won't hear that now, of course, when you're talking about the war in Ukraine. But it's a fact. So that comparison doesn't really work, but for most Americans, it does kind of simplify in their minds what's at stake. Because if you tell somebody, if Russia wins, you're going to live differently, you'll lose freedom, and you're going to lose democracy, that's a little bit easier to mobilize them in support of this war and continuing to send assistance to Ukraine than if you try to use some vague explanations that center on geopolitics and kind of the importance of maintaining the strength of NATO or the strength of the EU or trying to protect the leadership position of the United States in the world. All of that is not very tangible and doesn't resonate with many people in America. So that's the exterior. That's the threat from outside when we talk about what are the threats to democracy. But the threats to democracy in America in particular, in large part, come from the inside. And if you listen to President Biden and you listen to Democrats, they very clearly define that threat. They say the biggest threat to democracy in the United States right now are Republicans. And in particular, it's MAGA Republicans, those Republicans who voted for, and those voters, because they're not only Republicans who voted for Donald Trump, but anybody who voted for Donald Trump and continues to support Donald Trump, by definition, is a threat to democracy in the United States. And the language that they use, if you go back, and I don't know how many of you had a chance to see the President Biden's speech in Philadelphia, with even the symbolism, which many people on the right kept referring to, that it reminded them of Nazi Germany and the Munich speech, Hitler's Munich speech, where he basically said, these are our enemies. They're out to destroy American democracy. They're out to destroy our country. And he very clearly called out over 8 million people who voted for Donald Trump. And if we add independents who also now show that they're very concerned about where things are going in the country, they actually are talking about half of the country in the United States. They've defined them as the enemy. On the right is very upset, fearful, because of the constant politicization of institutions, government institutions. They see this as the greatest attack and threat to democracy. that what is happening is that the FBI, the Justice Department, the military, all the institutions of government that American democracy relies upon to maintain a consensus amongst its citizens that this system of government is the best system of government for America. This system of government allows for the best development economically, socially, politically for the country. That is all being threatened by the administrations and the Democrat Party's use of these institutions for repression of their political enemies, for attacks on basic freedoms of citizens, and for indoctrination. And so when I say indoctrination, what do I mean? The whole question of education in the United States is a very important political question. All throughout the country, we have grassroots movements of parents who basically rose up and said, we're not going to allow these school boards, which are elected, to impose values, ideology, which have nothing to do with basic education, have nothing to do with arithmetic, with science, don't have anything to do with social sciences other than they should be only one part of what's being brought to the attention of students. So they rose up and they've become the heart of a very broad spectrum of protests throughout the country. And so when we tie that to the fact that the Justice Department in the United States then decides that these parents are akin to terrorists, they use a provision of the law that was formulated after the attack on the United States and the Patriot Act, and they allow the FBI and other police and security organizations to target parents for not keeping quiet and not supporting the existing curriculum. So you can understand then why when the left looks at Trump and all the voters of Trump, they see the biggest threat to democracy. And you can understand when the right looks at Biden, looks at the leadership in Congress of the Democrats and everything that's happening with government institutions, that they see that the Democrats and Biden are the biggest threat to democracy. Kind of the absurd, it's almost as if there was some kind of soft coup in the United States against Donald Trump, and that it's being continually implemented, where institutions no longer are outside of politics, that they become a central component of politics. And because this is happening, political elites are losing faith in the system. I would argue that this is something that was evolving in the United States, where American political elites basically no longer believe in the superiority of liberal democracy or democracy. They feel, the elites feel, that first the people are not to be trusted because the people don't understand, they don't vote as they should vote, and they elect people like Donald Trump. So there's even a movement, as was in the UK after Brexit, to limit who can vote. So there's an argument that anybody over 70 or 75 should lose their right to vote. Why? Because there are studies that say those people tend to be more conservative. They tend to vote on the basis of traditional values and on the basis of traditional ideas. And so they undermine the way the political elites see democracy should be run and how decision-making should be influenced. Then there's also another argument that the political elites have lost the confidence that the free market and capitalism is a superior system of organization for the economy. And I think this goes back to the last major economic crisis when we all of a sudden heard in the United States for the first time that we cannot trust the market to solve all the problems. Because remember, the heart of capitalism is if you allow the market to work the way it should, healthy companies will survive and prosper, and everything that's not healthy will fail. But that's okay because something will come, something new to replace that. Then all of a sudden the economic crisis hits and we hear something very strange, which is Some companies in the financial sector, the auto industry, are too big to fail. We cannot allow them to fail, so what happens? The government intervenes, sends huge amounts of money, and keeps those institutions alive. And so that is a basic lack of trust in the essential component of the free market of capitalism. And so that's where the elites, I would argue, lost confidence in their economic system. So they are losing confidence in the political system and in the economic system. Now the most dangerous component, political elites are losing confidence in institutions of democracy, in government institutions. If you look in the United States, there's this argument that either the Supreme Court needs to have additional judges so that you can balance out the kind of political point of view of judges to the point where the political elites and the economic elites in the United States feel more confident that those judges will decide the way they think they should be making decisions. And at the same time, they're losing confidence, these political elites, in democracy, in democratic elections. And that's where the danger comes in, because they feel they have to intervene in the elections. They do it through media censorship and control. They do it through big money that comes in, even to local election boards and commissions that then change, as we saw in 2020 with the presidential election. During an election, they change the rules of the election. They do away with voter IDs, they do away with signature verification, and they allow people to register the day of the vote, regardless of any checks to see if that person has voted in a different district at the same time. So what is happening, I would argue, the political elites have lost confidence in the West, and in particular in the United States, in the political system, the superiority of the political system, of the economic system, and now they're losing confidence in something that is essential for democracy, and that's elections. And that's a very dangerous combination. The people are also, the citizens, are losing confidence. And we see this across the board with polling. People do not trust government. People do not trust media. People do not trust people of authority. And people are losing confidence in the basic fundamental values, their own constitutional and individual rights. So for the first time in my life, I'm shocked to see that about 60% of young people, people of your age, the students I'm talking to, are saying that you need to restrict freedom of speech, that not everybody should be allowed to express their political beliefs. For me, this is shocking. I never thought I would ever see that in my lifetime, because that's something that was at the heart of what made America superior and the American political system superior to anything else on the planet, was this essential component of freedoms, especially freedom of speech. And now we have a trend where many young people, but also the political elites, feel very strongly that freedom needs to be restricted. If we don't restrict it, democracy will come to an end, because there are too many negative voices, too many destructive voices that are confusing people, and they don't see the truth. And of course, the truth is what the elites say and the political establishment says and claims it is. That is kind of the framework for our discussions. And I wanted to lay that in order to give Ljiljana and Bob a chance to have a large parameter of issues and a wide scope to discuss them. And I hope I did a decent job in laying out those parameters. Bob?
Well, thank you very much, Obrad, and I'm honored to be invited to this important place, an Academy of Science and Arts. They tell me this is where the great minds meet, so therefore I can only be here for 1 hour, but I'm honored to be with you. In discussing the threats to democracy, of course, in discussing anything, it's important that you define your terms. And so let's define freedom. I define freedom as a three-legged stool. It is economic, political, and spiritual. And in a three-legged stool, if you take one of the legs away, it doesn't work. And so poor Gorbachev, He wanted to have more economic freedom because after all these years, communism only had, the Soviet Union only had what it stolen from the West and tried to reproduce. And he felt that they could do better. And so he wanted to have a glasnost, an opening where they could have more freedom. And he went over and he opened up the window economically. And the people began to perk up and breathe the fresh air. And they said, oh, there's the problem, the window. And so they went over and broke open the window politically. Because in order to be free, you have to have economic freedom. You have to have political liberty. But then there has to be a value system as to what is right and wrong. And there's only two options. One is what I say is right. One is what you say is right. And the other is what God says is right. There has to be a spiritual component. And without a spiritual component, democracy can be very dangerous. Because democracy says that rights come from the majority. In America, they were very cautious about that because there was a revolution going on in France at the same time that America was being founded in its constitutional convention. And in France, they wanted to get rid of the aristocracy, and they wanted to have rights come from the majority. And when rights come from the majority, that means that what the majority says is right, and there's no protection for the minority, which means they can even take their lives. So the symbol of the French Revolution was the guillotine. And the American founders said, that is exactly what we don't want. Therefore, the word, and this might come as a little bit of a surprise, and I'll need to clean it up a bit. The word democracy does not appear in any of America's founding documents. It does not appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. Because our rights do not come from the majority. They come from God. And God, who gave us life. And see, the French did away with God. They started, so in America, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of virtue or happiness. Notice the sequence. See, liberty is of precious little value if you're dead. You have to have life first, then liberty. And in the French Revolution, you started with liberty, equality. What happens when you try to have equality? People object. Why do you object? You have to kill them. So it's liberty, equality, and where do rights come from? The group, fraternity. So it's liberty, equality, and there's no protection for life. In America, we said we want protection for life, and where does life come from? Not from the people, it comes from God. The God who gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time. And that fight goes on continually. Our daughter spent a year in Rwanda trying to put that country together because under a democracy, 80% of the people in Rwanda are Hutu and 20% are Tutsi. And under a democracy, 80% can vote to kill the 20%. And they did. Over a course of 90 days with machetes, they chopped 1 million people to pieces. Well, therefore, there has to be a higher standard for freedom. There has to be economic freedom, political freedom, and spiritual liberty of a godly standard. And that then gives us the opportunity to compete. Economically, to compete to prove that our ideas are better. Politically, that our ideas are better. But man's nature, and man's nature doesn't change. That's why we have to keep God in the mix. Man's nature is he doesn't want to compete. He wants to use the power of government that only his company can succeed, as Obrad was referring to. So there's a constant battle to get government to protect their company, or to get government to protect their political idea, or to get government to eliminate other people's spiritual questions. That leads to death. That leads to poverty. So therefore, in this constant competition, it's important that we would have the discussion that we have here today. Let me conclude by saying this. If you were to ask me what is the most important thing I've ever learned in my entire life, it would be this: that everything in life is either physical or spiritual. And wisdom is the capacity to know which is which. We know that a glass is physical. Some people think love is physical. Love is not. Love is spiritual. Some people think peace is physical. If they just send enough diplomats to Israel on the border and discuss with the Palestinians enough tanks and water rights, and physically, peace is not physical. Peace is spiritual. And wisdom is the capacity to know where to spend our focus on what is physical and spiritual. Final point is this. What is the definition of truth? I can say that this room is 10 meters wide. You can say it's 9 meters wide. You can say it's 6 meters wide. And you can say it's 5 meters wide. And we can write white papers on it, and we can have conferences, and we can have international discussions, and everything's fine until someone comes and measures it. And that measurement is truth. Everything else is just opinion. But the significance of truth, it reveals error. Therefore, error hates truth. So someone comes in and they measure it, and it's 6.5 meters. And I said it was 10, and you said it was 9, and you said it was 8. Everybody in the room knows that what I said was wrong. Therefore, we all hate truth. So we want to prevent the presentation of truth. We want to go on YouTube and shut down communications and talk. We want to deny people the right to speak, because truth will overcome error, and freedom requires the expression of truth. And that is the constant battle for every generation. So don't be frightened. Your parents went through it, your grandparents went through it, and your grandchildren will go through it. And we must decide that we want to be on the side of freedom, which is economic freedom. We can compete. Political liberty, I have to stand out there and have a superior idea or I don't get elected. And I have the right to say that what I say is not right. God is the standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And I think you added a component that I left out, which is the spiritual element. And that's part of the discourse of many even academics and philosophers, like Francis Fukuyama, who basically addresses this issue and says basically that the elimination of the spiritual element from democracy is not harmful in itself, because you can have a secular spiritualism. And so his response, and the response of many on the left, is that you don't need God to have the spiritual dimension. And many then, of course, on the right come back at them and say, that is actually not spiritual. That's also, as you put it, an error that needs to be corrected, because it's a crucial error to maintaining stability within democracy and generating new ideas about freedom. Ljiljana, you have a lot to work with. I think you can pick and choose, but if you could also focus kind of on the role of media in this discussion of what's happening to democracy.
Okay, thank you. Well, Obrad has taunted me to challenge Mr. McEwen, but I'm not going to do it. And I would be out of my depth in this discussion of the spiritual basis of democracy. But I find it really fascinating to hear someone speak about America as if it's their country, another place, somewhere else. It's a foreign country, because the rest of the world feels that America is like this thing that hovers over all of us. And it's almost, I almost feel as entitled to discuss the internal dynamics of the country, what happens, as if I were a citizen. And sometimes I agree with people who think that we should all have the right, the rest of the world should have the right to vote in your presidential elections, because the outcome of your presidential elections determines often our destinies. Nowadays, of course, I think that maybe we, at least we Serbs, should get a chance to vote in the Russian presidential elections, because things that Mr. Putin is doing are going to determine our lives here, I'm afraid. Which brings me to Obrad's initial question of democracy versus authoritarianism. My personal take on that is that it's just Mr. Biden's tired, old, outdated attempt to present the world as he saw it, I guess, 70 years ago when he first entered politics. And now he calls it authoritarianism, but it used to be democracy versus communism. That's what it was, and he's just using an old rhetorical device or, Cold War slogan and trying to apply it to a somewhat different world. And in this case, Ukraine and Russia, I think it's a poor choice because it's not like Ukraine was this wonderful democratic country that we need to defend. Well, of course, South Vietnam was not a wonderful democratic country that maybe could be a poster country for democracy. But Ukraine seems to be a uniquely bad candidate for a model democracy because I'm someone who's West-centric. I've never been to Russia. I don't speak Russian. The United States of America are my point of reference. When we discuss freedom of speech, freedom of the press, my first instinct for many years has been, let's compare to what it's like in America. They have freedom of press. Let's see how ours compares to theirs. And it's in American sources. The reason I bring this up is that it is from American sources that I've heard that Ukraine was maybe one of the most corrupt nations on earth. At least that seemed to be the consensus before Putin attacked Ukraine. But I am bringing this up because I come from the world of journalism, and that world is a world of comparison, parallel analogies. And when I look at the United States today, including the way Mr. Biden is framing his foreign policy, where the organizational concept is democracy, I have to compare it to when, I guess, 30 years ago, the United States began interfering for the first time in the affairs of my nation. And what Obrad has listed, lack of faith in institutions, loss of confidence in the media, you can't trust anyone, we're polarized, we're two bitterly opposed camps who do not believe anything the other side says. Well, that's what a Yugoslavia that was breaking up, that's what it was 30 years ago. And the Americans came, United States Agency for International Development came and they said, look, your people do not trust the media is full of poison, and it's poisoning people's minds against other ethnic groups or other members of your own group that had different concepts and different ideas of politics. The reason for that is that you had a communist press. You didn't have freedom of speech. You didn't have freedom of the press. That's why your press is so awful, and that's why you cannot convince anyone of anything. That's why arguments do not work. That's why facts are not taken for granted, and that's one of the roots of your problem. So they said, we'll help you develop a free press. Well, looking at America today, it's like Return to the Future. It's like a rerun, except I almost have more sympathy, more understanding for the people of a broken Yugoslavia who had just lost all the pillars that had sustained our world collapsed at the same time. And then there was, we were losing a country, losing a system, losing our homes. And so maybe the level of despair and disorientation was perhaps more understandable than it is for me today to see a United States filled with anger for everyone of a different political or ideological persuasion. And when I hear Americans complain about how they can't trust their media, or, it's not like that they complain, but what I've recently read? That let's call it the popularity of Donald Trump, for example, the numbers have practically not changed. He polls about the same way he did 2 years ago. He polls about the same way he did around the 6th of January. Since then, before then as well, but since then, the entire mainstream media establishment has been, I could say propagandizing against him, but it's certainly been against him, attacking him, criticizing him, reviewing every action of his. He's been almost like he's being looked at as if he'd been an insect, and we need to look at everything he did and how he's caused damage. And yet, you look at those poll results, and the needle hasn't changed. About the same number of people think what they thought of Donald Trump 2 years ago, which for me is pretty demonstrative of the fact that they don't, but it's not even that they don't trust the media, it's that the media have no power anymore to alter anyone's opinions. And the reason they have no power to alter anyone's opinion is that not just that people do not believe in the facts, but that it seems to go beyond this belief is what is an objective fact. For example, it appears that about the same percentage of people who on January 6th believed that the election had been stolen from Donald Trump, still 40% of America today believes the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And when I say believe, what I mean by that is that these people feel we've lost the election, that loss is a theft. Something was taken away from us. And, I recently read an article in which someone's interviewing a miner from Appalachia, a county that voted 80% for Donald Trump at elections. And he is talking about what it was like when Donald Trump came to his community. And he said he came and, the rural whites, but rural population in America feels that they're the losers, the economic losers, and they have been the economic losers of globalization and everything. So Trump came to Appalachia and said, I'll bring back coal production. You'll dig coal again. And this miner says, I didn't think he'd bring back coal production, but when he looked at me and I felt that he saw me and that he knew what a loss I've experienced. And people who experience that kind of loss, they feel that something was stolen from them. So so what's fascinating for me is that the numbers, the investigation of the voting process, it's something that's been discussed for 2 years. Every time on CNN they mention the fact that Trump thinks the election was stolen, they always say Trump's baseless accusations, the big lie that the election was stolen. And none of this moves the needle one little bit. So clearly it's not a matter of Do we trust the facts? It's this underlying problem where I want to know whose side you're on. So this Appalachian miner seemed to feel that Donald Trump was on his side, and that he was on his side was enough for him to vote for, and he didn't have to believe his words about bringing back coal production. So I'm talking about this because it seems to me that this applies to what my American journalist friends told me 30 years ago. Ljiljana, if only you had a decent press, if only you had built up standards, if only your journalism schools taught journalism the way we do, and in our journalism school we tell our students, if your mother tells you she loves you, don't believe it, verify. Don't take anything for granted. But it has, in the meantime, it seems to me that today's America resembles more the Yugoslavia, which was breaking up politically, you know. Of course, let's be clear. America has a wonderful press, and I'm sorry that the business model has become cultivating one audience. Everybody's, and it's the same business model here. It used to be that everyone was racing for, at least it seems to me that everyone used to fight for the center, the middle ground. Now no one is interested in the middle ground. There's a total vacuum in the middle because no one's fighting for it. It's people want to express, people want to explain to you who they hate. And it almost doesn't matter what you believe in, but do you hate the same people? Do you see the same? We have become a group with those who feel they've been robbed by the same individual. So we had a country that was breaking up, and people were terrified for what was happening to them, and they had good reason not to believe the press, and they had good reason not to believe their elites, and they knew that they were going to be the losers, and that something was being stolen from them. And I am not putting any, I'm not going to take this moral attitude, like, look at these Americans, they don't believe anything. They're full of venom and bitterness and angry at each other. It seems to me this happens in crisis situations. It seems to me I should not have despised my own countrymen when they were afraid, disoriented, didn't know what was going to happen to them, and they didn't believe anyone, and they were looking for anyone who would recognize the fear in them, and they were going to side with that side. But this is also why I find it so difficult to believe in these slogans, the democracy versus authoritarianism or democracy versus communism. And Russia, we said why Ukraine wasn't a good fit. But look at Russia. Americans were so pleased with Russia when Yeltsin was in charge. Now, what do you think that tells Russians? That the Americans' favorite president was the one under which they lost the same things that the Appalachian miner lost after America was deindustrialized, basically. And look at Europe now. Europe, I saw this Belgian prime minister who is saying, I think 2 days ago, people are going to be angry, we may have social unrest, Europe may be facing deindustrialization. And I'll just finish with this. I consider it utterly disgusting to have a nation, a population, a large segment which is scared of the future, which is losing, which has legitimate economic grievances, which sees that it is going to be the loser in a process that's taking place, and to then say these people are awful, they're fascists. That's why they're complaining, because they're fascists. And one of the most disconcerting things today about America, because when I first started visiting America, it was a place of incredible civility. In fact, it was the place that Mr. McEwen has described. You know, we see this, what's our priority, first come life, and you know, this pursuit of happiness. I am a big fan of the fact that they put this in their founding documents, pursuit of happiness, that there's no country in the world, there's no empire, no group like that sees an individual's pursuit of happiness as a goal. So all these things I love. But when I first came to know America, it was a land of civility. Now they're calling each other fascists and Hitlers, and you very quickly realize that it's not about fascism. I mean, you know, even Orwell in 1946 was already saying fascism no longer means anything as a term. It only means something that someone whom we don't like coming to power. So it's never about democracy. It's my experience is it's never about democracy. It's always about power. It's who we want elected in certain countries. We want, when the right people get elected, we praise them, or we pretend that we don't see that they are. You know, it's like the United States helps groups in Syria, which are Islamic fundamentalists. And yet in Iran, they pretend they can't stand that women are made to wear the hijab, and that this is a matter of woman power. And actually, it's not a matter of woman power. It's always we want the women we like to be in power, and not these other ones. So the most disconcerting thing to me is how everyone's become a fascist and everyone's become a Hitler. I remember that very painfully from the time the president of the country I lived in was being compared to Hitler every day. That's why I'm very susceptible to people doing it here nowadays in our country. I think it's horribly wrong. We could have learned that it was wrong when we were being demonized. And I don't know why we do it to ourselves, but I certainly do understand why outside forces, outside powers do it to each others, and it's the same. And once you start calling everyone a Hitler, lo and behold, pretty soon you're calling your neighbor a fascist because they're not voting the way you want it. I'm sorry if I spoke too little about journalism, but I can come back to that.
Plenty. I'm going to abuse the power of a moderator to post the same two questions to both of you, because I want to get you to respond to the kind of the heart of what the topic is. First question, is the major threat to democracy, is it internal or external? That's the first question. I can imply from your remarks what I think you are saying, but I want to hear it from you directly. And the second question is, the second part of the discussion, what are the role, if there is a role, for liberalism and for conservatism? Is there any value in trying to use the framework of the past and using liberalism and conservatism as kind of some kind of measurement for political balance within, especially Western democracy? Or have things gotten to the point, and Ljiljana mentioned this, about a center, and that's like a sub-question to that last one. Is there room for a center in democracy? So.
You're the expert.
Whoever, Ljiljana, what? Bob, press that.
The question is inside or outside. I think that there is a tremendous global effort to subjugate all peoples and all countries. And that's about as profound a generalization as anybody can ever make. But I believe that the World Economic Forum does not really care about individual people or individual companies. They care about their power. And as long as there are strong nations, that stands as a hindrance to their global goals. Therefore, how do you can't defeat, they haven't the wherewithal to defeat them. So externally, so therefore they must defeat them internally. And they could use the World Health Organization or virtually any tool that they want to accomplish their goals. And I think that is a tremendous threat. Let me just quickly clean up a little bit my statement about democracy. Americans refer to democracy because we democratically elect people. Therefore, because we vote for people, we call it a democracy. But there's only certain things they can do. You know, in America, if you voted 95-5 to kill left-handed people, that would be a majority. But you can't do it because the Constitution protects life. And so we do not have a democracy in a dictionary sense. We call ourselves a democracy because we democratically elect people to the republic. And that's the distinction that we sometimes overlook, and I want to clean it up just a bit. Final thought, your question, Obrad, what was the second question?
Is there room for a center?
Is there room for a center? Oh, yes. And everything was said here, I cannot help but agree with it, that we go through these times where we get real excited and point at each other, and that's the way that we move. In America, there is a demographic shift, and if a person is very, very wealthy, they tend to be Democrats, and if they're completely dependent upon the state, they are Democrats. If they work and get a paycheck, they are overwhelmingly Republican. Now, that's never been that way in 100 years. And that is what has the institutions so distraught, because Donald Trump is a wealthy businessman, and he goes to the poorest working people of America, and overwhelmingly, these are people who have never met a person who voted Republican. And they are voting Republican by 70 and 80%. And that has all of those institutions just walking into walls, particularly the media, because they thought they could really describe everything, and they are completely out of what is happening on the street. And for those of us who are politicians, we just smile and laugh, because this is an exciting, exciting time to be alive.
Well, he's really posed a trick question where Mr. McEwen has to say, of course, the threats are internal, and I live in Serbia. I have to say the threat to my democracy comes from abroad, because the power that the United States have over countries, foreign policies, the way things are done in the world, but also the power they have over people who do their bidding in those countries. And when I say do their bidding, I'm not saying they're, the traitors who are funded by the U.S. to betray their national interests. I'm just saying that the United States has been in a position to really take advantage of the great respect and admiration that most of us have for America, and have nurtured a small group of people who propagate American standards and norms, or what America says its standards and norms are, and they become very vocal, because the United States has also helped foster a press which it likes to call independent, although it funds it directly. So they can rely on this highly educated and privileged group of people who are forever portraying themselves in their countries as outcasts who are in jeopardy. You would think they belong to communist cells during a Nazi occupation, but in fact, they're spokespeople for the world's most powerful empire ever, and they're often very apologetic for the greatest and most powerful military alliance the world has ever known. These people can always be relied on, so America has this formidable influence, not only directly over our governments, where they say, if you vote this way, even in the General Assembly, just watch what's going to happen to your purchases of oil or your other prerogatives or your chances to stay in the game of European accession. But more importantly, in many ways, I am far from glad to see American democracy in problems. American democracy, I believe, is in decline and is in trouble, and it is the worst thing that could have happened to me. Because I'm one of those people who say, look, you cannot do this. You cannot call a member of another party a fascist just because you disagree with him. But when they start doing it in the United States, I used to be president of Serbia's Journalists Association, and the government in 2009 proposed a draconian anti-European, anti-freedom of the press media law, and I advocated very forcefully against that law with the help of a legal opinion from one of the best U.S. law firms from Washington, but I couldn't get. But because all the Western embassies supported the president who wanted to pass this law, none of these embassies wanted to criticize the law. They let him pass that law, and later our constitutional court quashed it. But do you know, even people at the Bailoni Dorčol market, open air market where I shop, sellers would say to me, Ms. Smajlovic, if that law is so anti-European as you're saying, why aren't the Europeans saying it? Why are you the only one saying that? So problems of American democracy is the worst possible news for any of us, regardless of how we deplore America's influence on our countries. It's bad news. Just like we knew after 9/11, we would all feel terrible effects. And any, misguided or overwrought reaction of the United States would implicate us all. So I think there's a problem. I think there's a problem with both the politics and media, where no one is occupying a central ground. No one is saying, let's not call each other fascist. I don't know. When was the last time someone said, let's not use ad hominem arguments? So I actually watch what's happening in U.S. democracy with great trepidation and apprehension.
Thank you. We're going to open the floor to questions. And I ask that anybody who has a question, please identify yourself. If you're a student, tell us what you're studying and what year of study you are in. And your name, too.
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Srđan Jelisic, and I'm finishing my 4th year of political science at Faculty of Political Science here in Banja Luka, and I wanted to thank you to be here. Especially thank you for Mr. McEwen for yesterday's wonderful speech in Boljanic. I can say that locals were really impressed with your speech, and as someone whose great-grandparents took the part in that operation, that manifestation was really important to me, and thank you for took your part in it. So my question is, can you explain me some phenomena that I noticed during my recent stay in the United States? Recently, I came back from US from one academic fellowship, and I have a lot of talking with young people at that university that were majorly progressive and leftists. And I noticed some paradox that in the same time, they want more power for government to took its part in economy, in even choosing values in social security and so on. But on the other side, they really hate United States. They hate its history, and they see that through the prisma of racism, slavery, homophobia, and so on. So it is okay to disagree with some government's decisions. I here disagree with a lot of policies and opinions, both from government and opposition, but I don't hate Republic of Srpska nor Bosnia Bosnia and Herzegovina, I would rather participate in democratic processes and raise awareness of some issues that I think are important to me and my community. And how to develop to that patriotic sense in United States around that young people can be value United States and its country, to love it, and also to participate, to want to raise awareness for things that they think are important to them and for its country. Thank you.
What a great question to begin the discussion with. I'm going to let you take it. Well, let me start, and then please jump in, because they hear me all the time speak in the media, so they don't really need to hear what I have to say. But I think that is the paradox of the current political situation in the United States. It's what I talk about young people who favor censorship. You know, you would think that young people want as much freedom as possible to express themselves. And it always happened. My generation, it was how you dressed, how you spoke, what music you listened to. And I'm sure it was the same with your generations, that there was always this desire to have more freedom and not less freedom. But in some ways, people forget that if you restrict somebody's freedom, that affects you as well. You may be in line with the mainstream and the majority, as Bob would say, in deciding who has certain rights. But the problem is you're never going to be able to maintain power for forever. So the principle of freedom should not have to depend on somebody's interpretation. And I think that's what Bob was getting at, that when America was founded and American political system was developed, these were universal values that the founding fathers, it's an unpopular word right now in the United States to call them the founding fathers, but we can call them Parent One to be more in line with popular culture. They really did not see the restrictions that should be applied. Now, they had restrictions. There were restrictions on who could vote, how you defined who had the power of the vote. But the overall, the universal idea of where power comes from, they all held that to be true, which is that power does not come from the king, that power does not come from man, power comes from God. Now, I'm going to surprise you. That idea starts to take shape in the West with the Magna Carta, right? But before the Magna Carta, there's something called the Hilander Povelja, which was written a few years before the Magna Carta. And that also defines, so this is part of theology, if you will, for the Serbian Orthodox Church, but it's a political statement. In that document, you'll find, go back and look at it, the idea that power, that rulers are directly put in line with God, and they have responsibility for their decisions from God and for their subjects. So this is something that is common. It shows that it's not uniquely a Western concept. It's something that every culture in some way embraces, this notion. But at the same time, going back to your question, the problem is that education has become indoctrination. And I've argued this for a very long time. My first job was teaching political science at a university on the East Coast of the United States. I taught 2 courses, United Nations systems and world politics. And I was fascinated to see how at that time young people had no idea. The Cold War had just ended. The Berlin Wall had just come down. But young people in the United States had no idea about communism. They had no sense, even though it had just come to an end. Most of them, there were exceptions, but most of my students, they could not really define what communism was. They could not define the political system that the U.S. had been in conflict with for so many decades. Now we have a situation where most young people are not learning about these values and the origins of the values, where they come from, and why they're important, not to fight for your right, but to fight for everybody's right in society to express themselves, no matter what they say, right? And part of it is because things have changed in society since the Cold War. I would argue in journalism, there was this, it's because of what happened in Yugoslavia, there was this sense of activism. A journalist had to be an activist. There was no objectivity. There was no room for objectivity, for neutrality. You know, I had a debate once in a journal for journalists. The CPJ published it with Christiane Amanpour. And Christiane Amanpour, basically, because I had expressed this, that journalism called for objectivity, called for both sides to express themselves. And she said, no, that's not true. When it's a question of good and evil, evil should not be allowed to express itself. There is nothing that evil can do to justify what it's doing. And in the case of Bosnia, there's one side which is a victim and the other side which is evil. That was their argument. Well, what has happened is that there was a transference. It didn't only stick to international politics, international affairs, it became internal. It was the framework that journalists started to use in the context of American politics. So when they look at Donald Trump, the same way that they looked at Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina or in Yugoslavia, they see the same thing. There aren't two sides. There's only one side. It's the side of the good. And if you're not on the side of the good, then by definition, you are bad and you are evil in the case of Donald Trump. And that's what's happening is a simplification of the values and who should have certain rights and who should have those rights restricted. And the young generation, I'm afraid, because of what you said, they've been indoctrinated through the educational system not to value the freedom as it was intended to be applied to the citizens of the United States. They're afraid of it. And because they're being told constantly, too much freedom is not good, too many voices are confusing, you should trust us to be your filter. So what do? We create in journalism fact checkers. But who checks the fact checkers? And how are the fact checkers certified that they're fact checkers? Right? It creates a whole stream of process that once you begin unraveling these freedoms and trying to mask it as some kind of higher truth, it becomes very problematic. And for young people, I understand in the United States why they have a difficult time trying to come to grips with what's happening with their own country and how they view things in the past as being all bad, because they've been told that, not only in school, but in media, in entertainment, it's been reinforced. And everything that was good, there's no room for. Yes, there were many bad things, there were evil things, there were horrible things, but the overwhelming idea that prevailed was the idea that was guaranteed in the Constitution of the United States. The fundamental values that freedoms are built upon, the fundamental values of freedom, of liberty. And if you overlook that, then you end up in this position where there's nothing good that you embrace from your past and your tradition.
First of all, thank you for your reference about yesterday. I was extremely, extremely honored. And I would say if I could communicate to your grandparents that God will let them know how grateful we are for those Serbian families that sacrifice so much. I am extremely, extremely honored to have had that opportunity. I have admired those that sacrificed during the war. How appropriate that we're discussing it here, where the powers misrepresented, lied about, cheated, was treated unfairly, and yet they still did what was right. And when Mihailovich had a chance, they plead with him, you must come with it. He knew that eventually the day would come when they were going to stand him up and shoot him. And he did what he felt was right for his people. And that's, I was honored to be a part of it. Now, as we're facing this, let me just say something about America. The United States, never in the history of man, has one nation had the capacity to overrun another nation, but what it didn't do it. With the single exception of the United States of America after World War II, whenever a nation feels that Saddam Hussein can go into Kuwait, whenever North Korea feels it can overrun South Korea, whenever Russia feels it can overrun Ukraine, whenever there's a sense that there's not a balance of power, I think I can get away with it, they've done it. except the United States of America, after World War II, with the nuclear weapon, could have controlled anybody it wanted to, and it never did. Number one. Number two is, never in history has a nation shed blood and treasure for the freedom and independence of another and never ask anything in return. I was on the Veterans Affairs Committee, so now that World War II veterans are all dying, now the Korean veterans are the ones that are suffering the most. I mentioned to the Korean Parliament that in dealing with these 80-year-old Korean veterans, over 50,000 died for what? So that South Korea could be free, that's all. And yet, as they bear in their body the pain, never once have I heard an American Korean veteran ever complain about his sacrifice. It's been a very wonderful nation that is made up of people from all over, so that the National Security Advisor that decided to go to war in Yugoslavia, in Kosovo in the 1990s with Bill Clinton, and was Secretary of State, she grew up in Czechoslovakia. So those people come, and sometimes they do things that we don't 100% think are correct. I was walking over here this morning still bristling at the fact that she said, you know, she wanted to go to war. I'm still mad about it. It's only been 30 years. But it's Madeleine Albright. So they don't do everything right, but there's never been a more generous people that get sacrifice. Now, because you and I have grown up under this system, we need to be alert. See, in the Panama Canal, in which the world uses to transverse, Americans built it and owned it. But no American ship ever had priority. When an American ship came up, it had to get in line with everybody else because we wanted to treat people the same. Over 60%, between 60 and 70% of all maritime traffic on the planet goes through the South China Sea. Americans protect that access. Japan imports all of their oil. Americans don't ask anything in return. We don't charge people. We just do it so that the seas could be free. Let me just tell you, if these people have their way and America's destroyed and China controls the South China Sea, you will see what has been historically the case, that the most powerful nation on earth did what it wanted to do and there wasn't anything anybody could do about it. And if China wants to say, Japan, there's a 25% tax on all oil going to your country unless you break diplomatic relations with Serbia, and the Japanese are going to say all of our cars are going to be more expensive, we can't compete. We'll see what happens when the strongest nation on earth is not free and fair like America is. And throughout history, it hasn't been that way. You heard yesterday the Star-Spangled Banner was played. The Star-Spangled Banner is a song that was written on the night that America was about 25 years old, and the British were in a war with France, and it was the strongest nation on earth. It controlled the seas. And what happens when you're the strongest nation on earth and you're in a war and you need ships and you need people? You just go take them. Who's going to stop you? And so they did. And America didn't like it. All 7 million of them didn't like it. And so they went to war with Britain. And Americans, not Army, Navy, just God-fearing, freedom-loving Americans at the Baltimore, where the military base was, they went out and sunk 22 of their own ships in the entrance to the harbor. And so the British had to use these new rockets that had timers on them. They were supposed to land and explode, but they weren't very good. And they would explode in midair, and they could see that the American flag was still there. And then those same men went out and laid in the woods, laid in the weeds, because eventually you have to, after the artillery, you have to eventually put one foot in front of the other and do what the army. And so when they landed, there was no more explosions and it was all quiet. And that's when he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Can I see the star? What we saw at the twilight's gleaming, the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does the Star-Spangled Banner yet wave? So he didn't know if his country existed. Now, why was he in that fight? He was in that fight because the strongest nation on earth said, if I want a ship, I'll take it. If I want people, I'll take it. That's the way it'll work. Now, has America been perfect? Nope. But historically, there's never been a nation more generous, sacrifice, take more kicks in the shins and in the teeth for helping other people than America has. And in order to bring it down, economically or politically, about 30 years ago, they had to begin to infiltrate the universities. And America was always based upon meritocracy. If you had the best product or the best, and they wanted to shift to diversity. And so they want person, not because he's the smartest or the best, but because he fits this certain slot. And he didn't grow up in America, and he doesn't know America. He was taught to hate America, and now he's been doing that until now we have a generation of young people that are oblivious to history. And I'll conclude with this, because this is the most horrible thing I've learned in months. We were at dinner with a girl who's entering college, and we were discussing her high school education. And she described the only history course that she had. And it was called the 80s, the 90s, and now. And my wife, who is a licensed teacher, she about fell on the dinner table. You didn't discuss World War II? No. No. You didn't discuss World War I? No. You don't know when America was founded? No. You have to see, in order for me, if you're selling a toothpaste and I want to sell a new toothpaste, I can't just say, buy my toothpaste. I have to convince you your toothpaste is bad. It'll make your teeth fall out and it's really awful. After I've done that, then I can sell mine. And these colleges are in the process of convincing that freedom and free enterprise and abundance and wealth is bad. And so they have to wipe it clean, tell things that aren't true, and that's why it's dangerous in the days ahead. Bottom line, remember what I said when I began? Truth overcomes error. I am not afraid, because they're liars, and truth in the end always wins.
Actually, no, I have nothing to say other than you really are a credit to your nation. And I hope it doesn't sound too patronizing of me to have even said this. But when we listen to the way you stand up for your country and the magnanimity you show, because you come from a very powerful country and you sit here, people criticizing it, I have to say I just wish our politicians did the same for their countries.
Thank you very much. Hello, can you hear me? My name is Mirko Matic. I'm from Serbia, but I study in Sarajevo. I'm actually graduating politics. I have 2 more exams. I have questions. I have question about political correctness. Do you think that political correctness is a threat to democracy? Because you mentioned a political liberty as a pillar, as an anchor of democracy. But do we really have do we really have freedoms if we are afraid to say something? So that was my question. Thank you very much.
I would simply respond by saying that is the most powerful force that caused Donald Trump, who has never been elected to anything, who was a New York businessman, and New York businessmen are obnoxious. Let's just put it truthfully. So he had none of the political skills, but he stood up and said, calling a man a woman doesn't make sense. And everybody in the world said, yeah, you're right. But nobody's allowed to say that. And so he said the things that people knew to be true, offended people tremendously, and developed a following because he took on political correctness when nobody else would. So.
One more thing.
Applies to journalism too.
I sort of look upon political correctness as something in the past that was good compared to what we now have. Now it's, Obrad was saying you can't, that students are taught and that they themselves have adopted this attitude that you cannot say this, but it's worse than that. It's this new thing where you cannot say something because it's going to make me feel bad. And you have to take into account how I feel. And then in journalism, I find it endlessly irritating. Have you noticed how anchors on television keep telling you how they feel when they when they read a certain news item, and then they tell you how they have children who react this or that, and this is really infantilization, and I think it's very wrong. But political correctness was great because at least you said, okay, we don't say this because we're not racist or something. But now it's you can't say anything that's going to offend someone, and people take offense at amazing things. So I think we're way past political correctness and in a worse era.
We have one question over here, but I just want to add one more thing that's the problem at the universities. We're not teaching critical thinking at the university level. So our young people, when they graduate, get their diploma, they don't have the capacity to discern between all this competing information that's coming. They don't know how to think critically. They've been taught to accept certain references, certain voices that they have greater credibility than every other voice. And those other voices that challenge those thoughts, they should be ignored or they should be suppressed. And so you have these two factors at the university level that are very dangerous. And I'm glad, just based on these two questions, that that's not happening here. Gives me hope for the future.
Thank you very much. I'm Vladis Simovic, professor of political theory. I have one question for Mr. Robert. What do you think about Milton Friedman, Chicago Boys, and neoliberal doctrines today?
Pardon me. Economics is a science. It's math, and math is a science. Liberals try to pretend that something's not true. Eventually, the truth comes out. Milton Friedman is classical economist. So throughout history, classical economics has been founded. Now you have these little upstarts where you try this new idea, where if we just print money here, if we just do that, this will work. It never works. Eventually, you cannot change economic laws by passing legislation. They're immutable. And that's what Milton Friedman explained. And so people will constantly go back to him.
Thank you. My name is Grigor Samardžić. I studied philosophy and political science in Frankfurt and in Freiburg, Germany. So I have a few comments on... firstly, I want to thank you, all the panelists and organization. It's extremely important that we have such happenings here in Banja Luka also. So I noticed a mix-up of terms, as in conservative versus liberal and right versus left. So it's not always necessarily that some conservative is versus the left and vice versa. For example, you have the situation like if you are a conservative back in Yugoslavia in the 80s, you are on the left. But today you're mostly on the right, and the same goes with liberal and right, because the conservatives are pretty much liberals, for example, in many states in Europe. Also a comment on what Mr. McEwen said. I found your... I actually wrote it down. You said everything in life is either physical or spiritual. And the greatest wisdom is to know which one is which. And I find it very interesting because myself, I think of myself as a Hegelian. So this dichotomy is I find it really interesting. But then you went on to say it that peace is spiritual. don't mind me saying this, but as an American, of course you think that because America has been pretty much in war ever since the Second World War. So materialization of peace doesn't go that well, I think, sadly. But then you went on to say measurement, when you made an example of the truth, how we know something is true. You made a material example of measurement, not a spiritual one. And that is where we should maybe thematize more what values democracy brings and which kind of democracy do we want. Is it liberal democracy? Is it some... We had in history all kinds of democracies. And nowadays I think we always think of one art of democracy as democracy versus anything else. My question is, I guess, for all the panelists, where do you see the international order going in the next few years? Because we see it disintegrating pretty much for the last 20 years. And do you hope that we will get a chance to maybe write a new kind of international right? Because we see this kind of international order being violated on all sides, yeah. So not being respected, and every side is always concerned about the other side not respecting the laws. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification. When we put this discussion together, we were aware of the danger of trying to have an American approach with European approaches in discussing democracy, or even left or right, or liberalism and conservatism. And that's why we try to keep it undefined in order to allow plenty of room so that anybody could approach it the way that they felt most comfortable and most relevant from their own life experience, professional experience, and knowledge. Does anybody want to start with this? I'd like to just start with one thing, because this is what I've been thinking about and speaking about and lecturing about for a long time. I focused for at least a decade on something called post-democracy, and kind of this idea that there was a period of time that was coming in the West of post-democracy. And post-democracy, it was something amorphous in terms of definition, but what it did embrace were three things. One is that democratic evolution was coming to a situation where can it evolve even further? If we listen to Francis Fukuyama, it was the end of history and there was nowhere to evolve to. We had achieved the highest value for democracy. I was always skeptical about that for many reasons, but he really believed that. And then the second part of that component was what happens with the middle class, what happens with the workers, and how will they be able to find themselves, as Ljiljana referred to, how will they avoid being losers in this post-democracy setting? And the third part was, okay, what happens with elections? What happens with decision-making in post-democracy? And I think we see what I was afraid of was this evolution of kind of a corporate elitist approach to decision-making, where everything is structured and tried to influence either through money or through regulation or through last-minute changes like happened with the elections in 2020 to election law. Outside of the framework of law, let's say legalism as an approach, so it's not totally legal, but you use enough legal words to make it appear to be legal, and then you use that to have the elite determine outcomes. You have elections, outcomes in terms of who wins, who loses economically, and who controls the political process. And so that was post-democracy. Now, I think when we're talking about the international order, I've been very vocal in saying, and now I'm glad I'm not a lunatic, because I'm the only one talking about this, because there was a while for a few months where I thought people were looking at me like something happened to him, he has lost his mind. I say this is the end of Western dominance of the international order. It's done. And the irony is that the Western leaders, who I would argue are the worst in the last 100 years, we've had this group of Western leaders, in my eyes, in my opinion, in my experience, are the absolute worst to possibly have to deal with all of the challenges in front of our nations, in front of our states. So I think they've expedited this process. I think they've assured that something that would have taken a decade or two to happen in terms of the end of Western dominance, they've made it come to fruition. Because the first thing they did is they put the interests of their citizens, of the common person who elected them, they basically disregarded their interests. And we heard the German foreign minister who basically said, when asked about Ukraine, she said, I don't care what my voters think. I don't care what they support. So, but that's not an isolated viewpoint. The political elite, even in the United States, we had a senator, a woman, who was talking about the high price of gas. And she said, you know what? I drove past those gas stations with a smile on my face in my brand new electric car. Right? It's as close as you can come to the phrase in the French Revolution, let them eat cake. Right? This was an utter disrespect for the struggles that common people, that the middle class, that the working people are facing in the United States with inflation, rising costs of living in every aspect of life, right? And so when we talk about what's happening in the international order, I would argue very strongly it is the end of Western domination. Western domination, and this is where my good friend Bob and I a little bit differ, because I don't think America has been benign as in the unipolar moment. I don't think those well-intentions that had guided American policy after the Second World War, I don't think they survived after the Cold War. I think power went to the heads of American politicians, and they decided to create a world that they wanted to rule. Liberals. Well, they were in charge, right? So not all the time. Yeah. But we can argue what the neocons are. In reality. I mean, this is another one of those philosophical debates about ideology. But let's set that aside because I think it's irrelevant. So when you give people alternatives, and now the world is going to have alternatives, the dominance of the West in banking, the dominance of the West in international financial transactions, the dominance of the West in giving credit to developing nations, the dominance of the West in terms of political ideas, that is done. Now, what comes next? I'm one of those who are fearful. You know, like Ljiljana. I lived in the United States. I grew up in America. I believe that the American political system is the best. The way that I experienced it growing up. The way I learned about it. The way I lived it. But this is not what I recognize in the United States right now. It's far from what it was. And because of that, when we talk about what comes next, I'm fearful. Because I don't know if there's an alternative that offers something that was as powerful and as convincing of its superiority in terms of individual liberties, in terms of freedom, in terms of the fundamental values. And here is where I agree with Bob totally. And you cannot separate spiritual when you discuss these fundamental values. Because they're founded, the people who had the ideas about freedom were heavily influenced by their faith. And if we ignore that, then we ignore a founding principle of democratic discourse, of democratic evolution of society. So again, it's going to be a multipolar system, that's very clear. And Ukraine now is irrelevant to me. I don't think it matters who wins the war in Ukraine. I think what I'm saying happens no matter what. Why? Because China is not directly engaged in the war. America is directly engaged in the war. NATO is directly engaged in the war. Europe is directly engaged in the war. Russia is directly engaged in the war. China is not. So China is sitting back, and in many ways, this is kind of the best of all worlds for China. And again, it comes back, I'll end here because it's been too long, when irrational decision-making in the West. At the same time that you decide to go to war with Russia, to impose these sanctions that are hurting your own citizens, you decide to continue the green transition. So you say, not only are we going to cut off a major source of energy for Europe and for many countries in the world, But we're also going to force our societies to end dirty sources of energy at the same time. And we're only going to use clean energy. And this is exactly what's happening in the United States right now. So there's no recognition that you cannot do that. You cannot do this transition in a time of energy shortages, crisis. So I end with this because it's very important. If somebody here thinks that there's going to be a change and that Western leaders are going to be more rational than they have, I'm not that optimistic. I don't think there's any indication of rationality in their decision making. I think the only hope I have is fear. And it's fear of what the consequences are of escalation. And the consequence that I fear the most is nuclear war. And we've never been closer than now to a nuclear war. I don't want to end on that horrible note, but I don't know where else to end. So.
First of all, thank you for your question. I think you just grasped everything perfectly, and that was encouraging. So let me just close with one personal observation about what you said, what we discussed about the physical dimensions of the room. So I say it's 10, he says it's 8, he says it's 6, but the truth is 6.5. That those that are 8 and 10 and 15 meters, we can have conferences, we can give awards to each other, we can have white papers, and we can have all of these things. The one thing we're not going to tolerate, though, is the measurement, the 6.5, because 6.5 is the truth, and it reveals that all of us are wrong. So how do you know where the truth is? They tend to go after it. And I will just conclude with this observation personally, that if I were asked to speak before an official gathering in virtually any place, and I prayed in the name of Mother Earth and eagle feathers and the firmament, no one would care. But if I prayed in the name of Jesus Christ, my Savior, everybody would get upset. Why?
Or nervous.
That's my only thought. Thank you very much.
This is going to be the last question because of the need to also give a statement to the press, and we have to go because they're on a tight schedule. Our guests are on a tight schedule. So please identify yourself.
I'm Siniša Grabež. I'm a film director. Now, I wanted to speak in Serbian so that you hear Serbian for a change. Unfortunately, I do not speak English that well. I'd like to know more about this spiritual aspect that you keep referring to and we keep referring to. So, I have a question for you. Do you think that the West, specifically the USA, are seeing now the crisis of spirituality? And is actually nihilism reaching its full maturity, if I may put it like that, so that everything's become relative? Yesterday I read an article. The title was Hatred as a New Love. So this may be interesting for you. So in the public space, hatred has become a new in. Maybe this is an awkward term, the new in. But this relativization has resulted in the following. For example, we are talking about now liberalism. And what's the ultimate goal? What's the end? I do not want to sound banal, but this all seems to me as devil's work, because this level of relativization of truth and human nature does not lead to anything else but a complete change of paradigm and an utter relativization of everything. So I'd like to cut the story short. Sorry, I digress too much. What do you think? Is this a geopolitical issue? Is it a geopolitical crisis? Or is this a crisis of spirituality of the West?
I beg your pardon?
It's mostly directed. Did you understand the question?
Yeah. And, no, the final question was, is it just the West? And I certainly don't think so.
Is it a geopolitical question, or is it a crisis, a spiritual crisis of spirituality, a lack?
I think Obrad and I are in complete agreement on this, and he's more articulate than I, so I will let him answer.
Well, he listens to me all the time. Why don't you?
So give it to me again.
So is this crisis geopolitical, or is it a crisis of spirituality?
In the West.
In the West. So is it the question of the lack of faith, in other words, that you were describing?
I don't know. It's both, probably. Yeah. It's foolish to try to discuss economics or politics and not recognize human nature. Yeah, which is a spiritual issue. So it covers it all. And a person, they're just wasting time if they don't use that piece, in my judgment. It's the spiritual sense of fulfillment that makes people want to get up and go to work and to produce and provide for their families. You can't quantify that. You can't dispense it. You can't buy a pound of it. And so to have an economy working together, so that's a profound question. So profound, I don't think there's an answer.
I'm going to wrap up, but one of the things that I want to say is Bob and I share faith in the sense that faith is very important to us. Ljiljana gives me a hard time all the time over this, because I always tell her whatever crisis or whatever happens, it doesn't matter, because God always provides the right opportunity. And I go through life being guided by my faith, and my faith, the key component, even in politics. I had a panel like this with students, and they wanted to know, could you be a believer in God and still be a politician? It was a very interesting discussion. And so, and I had the most critical voice was actually somebody from Scandinavia who got very angry with me with an answer on homosexuality. So he said, if you're the president and the gay pride parade is coming, and what do you do? And I say, I have to honor the law. But he said, you're a believer. How can you honor the law? Well, my belief is one thing, but there's a separation between church and state. I have to honor the law, which means I have to protect basic rights of individuals. That does not mean I agree. That does not mean that every sin I embrace because of the law, but it means that the sense of duty, and you can see this again, I refer to you to read the Povelja, Hilandarska Povelja, the sense of duty and responsibility has to be in line with your office. And your office and your oath is to uphold the law. Now, I have to do everything I can as a believer to change that law. I have to fight for what I believe and my faith. And if I'm successful, the law will be something else. But that law should not, if it's something else, interfere with the basic rights that every living being has, right? And that's security, that's the right to your freedom, the right to all the protections of your rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution and the law. All of that has to stand, regardless of what I think somebody should have a right to or not. Now, the most important thing for me in your question is the essential element is love, right? Because that's what the founding principle of our faith is. It's love. It's God's love, agape. It's the love that when you do whatever you do, whether you're a student, whether you're a professor, whether you're a politician, whether you're a diplomat, you have to do everything you do with love. Not only love with reference to your faith, but love of your nation, love of your people, love of the law. And if you do, even if you go to war, you have to do it through love. You do not hate your enemy. You do not hate what your enemy is doing. You hate what is a threat to you, to your people, to your nation, and you have to deal with that threat. And I really believe very strongly that you cannot separate the question of political philosophy, like Francis Fukuyama argues, even in his new book, Liberalism and Its Discontents. You cannot separate faith and discuss democratic evolution and believe that secular approach to filling the spiritual void is going to solve problems that essentially were defined by the liberties and the freedoms that democratic societies adopted because of faith. It didn't come from somebody's thinking one day. It was heavily influenced by faith. We can't ignore that. And it's a mistake for any decision maker to try to separate that when they're coming to trying to decide what to do at this particular time. So I'm very, and even though Ljiljana gives me a hard time, especially with certain things, and she says, well, God will take care of this for you.
Now, our average time is not bad at all. Today, we've had an opportunity to hear so many interesting things. The narratives or scientifically based facts, generalizations, dehumanization of other groups, system values and perceptions, whether we form communities based on who we love or who we hate, whether on positive and affirmative things or not, whether we build ourselves so that we can look at every person as a human being, regardless of their political, religious or ethnic or any other affiliation. A lot of what we've heard today about the United States, the European Union and Europe can be probably recognized and apply to our society and our lives. It would appear that these topics are interwoven with universal stuff. I hope that you share my opinion that we were not wrong to share this with our presenters this morning, that we spent this time very wisely. I would like to thank them sincerely for everything, for their efforts, love, support. And to you also, once again, a big thank you from the bottom of my heart. And in the context of everything that has been said in this value system, I would particularly like to thank my associates, Svetlana and everyone else, and the cameraman and the translators, because without them, all this would not be possible. So everyone is needed in this community in order to succeed. And I'm saying this primarily for the young people's sake. Thank you once again. The journalists are waiting. We need to honor them as well. I hope we shall see each other soon as well. All these contacts will be shared on our website. We will continue to discuss and to expand this forum inside the cyberspace as well, and I hope that we will continue our cooperation, that we shall see each other soon. Thank you.